Start recording. Hello, everybody. Thank you for showing up. Today, I'm going to be talking about where the deaf community started in history, and we're going to try and cover a globe. I do want to have some announcements before we get started. This is recorded. Captions are on. Please feel free to use them if they're helpful to you. I will be signing and lecturing. I'll be using a technical sign language called PSE, that is signed English, using ASL signs in English word order. For those needing visual language support on top of that, feel free to utilize the captions in conjunction with pinning me to the front. There are some visually stimulating slides. I will be verbally reading those for those people using auditory support. I did not have a chance to run these through a color checker, so I'm sorry for those with visual accessibility. If you cannot see something displayed on the screen due to color, feel free to drop that in the chat and I will verbally describe that too, and I apologize. I can email you a copy of this presentation and I will make sure it gets posted if you want to go back and look at the slides. I do know it's kind of long. I was really motivated and passionate about this and I kind of got into it a bit. My name is Laird Wood Infuni, and that is Swedish for wood, the foundling. And I live here in the West. I am the head emissary. Those are the types of sign languages I know for the kingdom. Our emissaries do cover more than sign language, but right now we do not have any spoken language emissaries, and we are looking for that. I do a lot of outreach for DEI and accessibility awareness. I have covered the position of Accessibility and Inclusivity Officer for the Principality of Sinagua here in the West for the last 4 years. I do a bunch of hobbies, as you can see. I participate in plays, I do bardics, I play musical instruments. I play around in multiple languages, not just signed languages, but such as French, Arabic, Spanish, Latin. I have a lot of multicultural fun. This is a particular topic that is very passionate to me. Now, the presentation. Sorry, I am cutting and pasting. This presentation can be found here at this website. This started as a Queen's Apotheca web display. You can see the original web display at this site. Sometimes Zoom. Sorry. Okay. There are videos within this presentation. We can, if there's time after, watch them. I will be putting their YouTube addresses in the chat when we get there and when I talk about what's in those videos. At the end of each era time, I'm gonna stop and you can ask your questions. Feel free to put them in the chat or you can wait to the end of that section, whichever, but I will be stopping to give you time for that. Going through history, the documentation on disability, persons, communities, support, there really isn't a lot of documentation. For a lot of history, they just didn't make note of those peoples. They weren't really considered important enough to be noted in historical documents. Much of where my evidence comes from are PhD doctorates who have gone through and done a lot of that in-depth research into those historical documents to pull references. So they'll be looking at a document from some Caesar in Rome, and it'll make mention of something about a deaf person analogy. And that's how we find our historical evidence. There's not a lot of direct evidence. I do have a bibliography of all my research, my first, secondary, and tertiary sources, and that is listed here. You can, so sorry. So you can find that on the website display. It's on the last subpage. I don't know why it moved slides and didn't paste my link. I'm so sorry. Hearing, deaf, blind, it doesn't matter. People are people. As they come together, they're going to form a community. Sorry, there it is. Thank you, Zoom. So when we talk about these communities, we're going to be looking at how the society defined them, and there's a lot more that is not covered here. So now back to that. What we can see is historically, as we move forward, these people who have used these languages and evolved throughout history to come here, we can see some amazing things happening in the world today. Like in Indonesia, they are using a multimodal language. The official language of the country is both signed and spoken, and you can't speak one half and not the other and still communicate. And the reason for that is they have a very high, almost 50% of the population is deaf. But how did this evolution happen? This is another tour of the documentation, and that is what I mean by the evidence of today. We can look at tribes like the Bantu or Indonesia, and we can see these ancient languages still exist today and how they're incorporated into the official languages that are used today. In the ancient era, people who lived here, they had to go live in isolated groups, and it was a societal thing to kick them out. People were scared. They were afflicted with disease. They didn't understand what deafness was, so they assumed it was a disease. And out of this fear, they would send them out to live in these communities by themselves. They weren't given any real resources. They weren't given much in the way of support. Everyone just knew that that's where you sent these people, and they were sent to figure it out. So this led to a belief that everyone who had deafness must have gotten it from these diseases that cause deafness. So meningitis, syphilis, one of the side effects is they can cause deafness, but you can also be born deaf. Maybe the bones in your ear didn't form. Well, they didn't know anything about the inside of the body. And if you look at the science of the time, they didn't even know what the inside of the body was. So they had no real way to rationally evaluate what they were seeing. So they just assumed that everything came from the same thing. We see these diseases cause deafness, so every deaf person must be diseased. We still deal with this misunderstanding today. We see today people who are like, oh, you're deaf. Well, what did you do to get that way? What illness did you have? And it is something that the deaf community today really has done a lot of education and outreach to try and like re-educate. You can be born deaf and never been sick a day in your life. There are So this is where that started. And it does date all the way back to the ancient era. And it does explain why a lot of our systematic perspectives in government and policy, why we have a hard time resolving some misunderstandings about the limits of communities. But a lot of people who lived in this time often had a multimodal language already. Whether they were blind, deaf, nonverbal, whatever, they still worked around their villages. They were still part of family life. Native tribes used a language made up of both signed and vocal components. Right now, I'm giving this lecture from land that was once, land that the Nissen tribes, this is their native land. And that tribe has a multimodal language that has both parts and are required. And if you go and look at tribal culture today, they have a very proud culture that still uses a vocal and sign language in their ceremonies, their rituals, and a lot of their native cultural relevance. And it's preserved by law in a lot of places. But it started all the way back in the ancient era, where each tribe had its own specific language, and it was passed down through those rites that we still see today. And it was developed. They actually had like multiple different ways to communicate within the village, with other tribes. Really fascinating. My favorite tribe that I looked at was the Bantu. They're around Congo and Nigeria. And the Bantu language is still used today, and it's very close to its original form. It has lasted as a culture for over 65,000 years. Their roots go back to this era, and I think that is really cool. This video can be found on YouTube. I put the link in the chat for you. And they actually like speak the language, and you can see both parts, and they share how both parts are in their culture. Australia and New Zealand have recently preserved this language as a historical treasure, and it is protected by law. I think that's really cool. Sorry. Oh, I already said that. This is a slide saying that Australia and New Zealand have preserved these tribal languages, and that they date back over 65,000 years. Sorry, I got ahead of myself. But native sign languages are used around the world by a lot of people without hearing loss. It's part of their cultural identity. This book that is the background of this slide, and it is titled I, the Aboriginal. It's written by Ainsley Roberts, and it talks about the stories around Africa. And it talks about how his cultural perspective through these stories that have deaf characters, have this multimodal language, how when he came into Western civilization, what that was like for him. And the book, it it talks about his journey as he shared his world with this scientist and how he later became a doctor. It's a really cool look at the cultural integration and where multimodal language fit in the this book was written in the 1960s, but he talks his culture goes back to the ancient era and why that separation when they looked at the 1960s happened. It's very interesting. By the time we get to 1200 BC in Egypt, we're starting to see actual recorded like historical documentation. An Egyptian magistrate was recorded by his officials as saying, quote, "Thou art one who is deaf and does not hear, to whom men make signs with the hands." These references are what I was talking about at the start when I said there's not a lot of direct documentation. What this evidence shows us is that deafness was found throughout the Egyptian area in everyday life. They see them every day. Remember, before they were out living in these like ostracized little villages. You wouldn't see them every day. That's why they weren't put into any of the references. But now we're seeing them pop up in everyday speech, in everyday references. So now they can't be living out there. Now they're part of everyday life, like daily life. So it's a significant change. And by 1000 BC, we're seeing along Nigeria and Congo, remember the Bantu tribe, this inclusion from tribal life is starting to be seen in the quote westernized civilization, where in Egypt they wouldn't have seen this tribal inclusion, but now it's starting to become that way. They're starting to see deaf living with their families, and we're seeing a pattern as this tribal life starts to influence Egyptian culture. Oh, we're also starting to see the birth of a lot of the cultural identity, making for bilingual families. Let's hop over to Israel. It's not a far jump from Africa. The Torah denied deaf and nonverbals equal rights and denied them participation in specific rights, or by being witnesses in courts. They could not testify in a court. This is big because other religions, they also influence deaf rights, but the Torah specifically revoked being able to get married, owning property, testifying in court on your own behalf, signing a contract for a job. They were sent to go live with their families. At least they weren't being, isolated. But it is the first time in history we see documentation that truly defined a way of life and a limit for deaf people. This is also the first time we've really seen religious influences defining those legal rights. But this is the first time in history we see a law that protects the deaf. The Torah, while taking away all those civil rights, also gave a major protection. No more could you say that you were cursed by God and send them away. You can't hex or place on somebody a curse. You can't harm them. Why? Because God is giving them a spiritual punishment. Therefore, you cannot interfere. You're not bigger than God. He's dealing with it, not your problem. So that said, legally on paper, you couldn't do these things. That's not to say we didn't experience that in real life, as we can see from the stories of the time, but at least it was an avenue now that protected them somewhat. And it's the first time it was ever put down on paper where it could be enforced. Enforced. Okay, so back to Africa, their stories are featuring deaf characters. Lujoyu at this time was a nonverbal woman who used a single hand, one hand sign language and talked only with one hand and was like famous for it in this world. The whole village could easily converse with her, and it was not a major point of the story. It was just a natural background. Of course, Lujoyo was deaf. Lots of people are. Of course, the whole village signed. Why wouldn't they? Because remember, in the Bantu tribe, going all the way back, they used a multimodal language. So what's cool about this story is it's the first time that the main character, the hero, was deaf. And it's the first time historically documented that we see such natural inclusion in the cultural life. Now, that said, I do want to point out that not all stories depict deaf well. Historically looking, deaf characters often have a depiction of the fool or are, are put down intellectually, like they're diminished. This character wasn't. She was witty and intelligent. And I think it's very interesting that that image changed and the lower depictions won out. This book, Indaba, My Children, again, it was published in 1964, but it's a deaf, non-verbal character who used sign language in their story with several other characters very similar, and it's a direct reflection back to these Bantu stories where that had deaf characters and multimodal language. This also is an anthology of stories from all over their African background, their African folk tales. And it starts with tribal life, and they're all tribal stories that date back to the Phoenicians. It's a very cool look at African history. Buddhism starts spreading in about 500 BC, and it brings with it these stories. Inside these stories, they often had characters who were deaf, blind, had other perspectual differences from the norm. And these are very common in all the Buddha stories, but they're starting to spread. And we start seeing it influencing cultures at this time. These Buddha stories also show deafness as a part of daily life, which is in direct contrast to some of the other isolationist things we're seeing happening in the West right now during this time. One story called Three Deaf Men dates all the way back to the Phoenicians and shows deaf people to not be very intelligent, supports the evidence of how society sees them as dumb. That story is direct evidence to the deaf and dumb imagery that we have now. I mean, we're still dealing with that. The term mute is very offensive to a lot of deaf and hard of hearing people, and it's a direct relation back to this. This story from the Phoenicians became famous. And it really affected so much about how deaf were looked at. The Phoenicians were a Semitic speaking people of somewhat unknown origins who emerged, pardon me, in the Levant area around 3000 BC. The Phoenicians are related to the broader group known as Canaanites. These are the biblical people that were famous from the Bible. They were known to be skilled traders. They were known to be good mariners, seamen. They were civilized, educated. They developed massive trade routes all over the seas. And that lasted over a millennia. Now, they are known to be one of the major cradles of civilization that Greece, Egypt, Mesopotamia all grew from. And they had these city-states set up that we're used to seeing from ancient Greece. This was meant to be a comedy. It was not meant to be a serious piece or a serious representation of a community. It's not a documentary. It was meant to be a comedy and for fun. But you can still see how that slapstick kind of comedic humor has lasted through the era into today when we look at deaf and comedy. In 44 BC, we had the first recorded deaf person in all of history to be named in a historical document. This was Quintus Pedius. The person who recorded him was a man named Pliny the Younger. He was a lawyer and a magistrate in ancient Rome. His uncle helped raise and educate him, and he grew up to write hundreds of letters for magistrates. He was basically a scribe. He was so good at it and organized that he became famous for it. In one document, he talked about Quintus Pedius, who was the son of a Roman senator and was the paternal he was related to Marcus Valerius Corvinus, the famous Roman, and the Emperor Augustus was his cousin. He was like famous for being related to famous people. He was a painter, and that was all he did with his life. He died at a young age 13, of an illness that wasn't even named in his 2 lines that Pliny wrote about him, while applauding his uncle who paid to have him educated in the art of painting. He has 2 lines, it's not a lot. But he was the first. It was acknowledged that he couldn't hear, and he was acknowledged as being a really good painter. And the early Buddhist missionary work. And on here, you'll see a map of where I showed the spread of Buddhism across India, Burma, and up through China into, if you'll see, into Korea and Japan. It went all the way east through Afghanistan. Now I'm pointing it out because it's not just characters and stories now. Now the teachings themselves are including deaf and blind. And we have this character named Tsunbo Jizo. I'm so sorry if I said that awfully. I'm sure I said it wrong. But it's He's from Hongo, Tokyo, and up through China, he became famous for being the deaf Jizo. Jizo is one of the four Bodhisattvas, one of the four people to have transitioned to nirvana. So he's supposed to be teaching others, right? And so he comes back and there's all these different aspects. You have a deaf Jizo, you have a blind Jizo. There's one who's a farmer. There's one who is a rain making Jizo. Like they have tons of these. And the point is that every face of Jizo has something to teach, has enlightenment. Well, deaf Jizo is very popular at this time and starts spreading stories about his former life as deaf Jizo. And you can still see and you can still order this Jizo's representation. You can see him in some of the Buddha supported restaurants and cultural stores. He is still a popular figure today. Now we come to the Middle Ages, so let's stop. Does anyone want to talk about the ancient era? Is there anything I didn't explain well? Okay, I'm going to assume no and keep going. Don't be afraid to raise your hand or pop something into the chat if you want to ask a question. On the whole, deaf communities outside of Europe are still largely living the same way they have since the ancient era. Nothing's really changed for the tribes. They were already pretty inclusive. What you see is a lot more characters and stories and stuff like that, but like daily life, they were still a part of the community and their families and still lived whole lives. But two things do start to happen in the Middle Ages. One, in Europe, they start allowing deaf to work and live inside towns like the tribes were doing. Second, views about the deaf that need to be fixed to match their religious ideology, that gives birth here. This whole idea that deaf is something that needs to be fixed starts in the Middle Ages. The indigenous tribes' natural tendency to include both the manual and spoken parts of their culture to their rites and their ceremonies specifically, that starts to evolve and grow into Western civilization. It's not like it changed for them. It's not. The changes it's starting to affect all of the Western European cultures. They're starting to see it. I do want to talk about monastic sign language, and we'll get into it in a minute a little bit deeper, but it's technically not a language. The whole point of monastic sign language is to limit communication. It was developed for monks who needed to communicate the daily needs, but they have taken a vow of silence. So they weren't allowed to speak or communicate. And the point is to communicate. Now, Saint Augustine, he had a fascination with deaf communication. He had seen monastic sign. This was different. And even though the deaf were protected in some ways legally because of religious belief that, God is handling their spiritual punishment, this also led to a diminished view of deafness on the whole. That Saint Augustine gets a bad he gets looked at wrongly. He gets accused of holding to views that weren't actually his. But this does lead to me believing why there weren't as many records and why what we do have of this era is a lot of St. Augustine. He was just fascinated with it, and so he recorded a lot. Other people, not so much. So I did want to let you know about that as we're moving forward. The earliest surviving statements about deaf communities, their culture itself, comes from African history and St. Augustine. But even though he's very, very like positive about deaf culture and very progressive in his thoughts on deafness, he was limited by the science of his time. He's not a scientist. Science said in this time that deafness was caused by disease or original sin. God punished you one way or the other. And that influenced what he knew about deafness. And it reflected how the sign language itself was looked at. It wasn't even considered a language. It couldn't be, because that was revoked by them from God. God is taking away their ability to speak for whatever crime in their past life or prior to their birth. In 100 AD, right, we have Emperor Hadrian. He was half Hispanic and half Roman. He settled in Spain after moving from Italy. And it was like everybody knew, it was well known that he's deaf in one ear. Could not hear at all in one ear. He had diminished hearing in the other, but it wasn't good. There are pictures of him on horses riding out onto the battlefield with his hand like this, leaning into his commanders, listening to them as they shouted what was happening so he could give commands. But his logic, his reasoning, his tactics were so good. He was well respected. He was asked for. He was looked at as a leader in the community. Later in politics, he was asked to become a politician. Well respected deaf person in history. Now we're in Tunisia. And this map, I hope you see it. Tunisia is not that far from Italy. Yes, I mean, it's next to Algeria and Libya. It's technically across the Mediterranean Sea. But it's still kind of close to Europe. At the time that St. Augustine was stationed there, it was called Numidia. And he talked about how the deaf would talk with each other, like talking, communicate. He didn't call the language, but he made special note of the intelligence that the deaf used and their ability to communicate ideas that were bigger than just necessity. They were expressing concepts and emotions and discussing politics. They had an understanding of those things that was not elementary and could communicate those things back and forth. That was special and new. That was not an idea that had been discussed or realized or accepted before now. And St. Augustine, he took crap for that in his time. St. Augustine was not even believed and he struggled for his whole life to be believed by the church. He got laughed at one point. It's recorded. Now in Greece, 400, we have Plato, and in his writings, the Catalyst, Catalist, so sorry. He makes reference to the deaf, and he says, suppose that we had no voice or no tongue, and we wanted to communicate with one another. Shouldn't we, like the deaf, unfortunately deaf and dumb, make signs with the hands and the head and the rest of the body? What he discusses here is the philosophy of communication being bigger than words. He's noting that sign language in use by deaf and nonverbals elsewhere in society that they see in their daily life are communicating, and that they're using higher language. And so shouldn't we acknowledge that that's what we would do too? Like, what else would they do? And that implies for the first time an acknowledgement that of human equivalency. He's not acknowledging their equals in like status, but as a human, that's a human. And if we wanted to talk and didn't have tongues, we would do that too. That's a sense of equality as human to human. And that's the first time in history that that is noted. 700 in Palestine. Palestine healers brought deaf and blind from all over the area into Jerusalem to be healed. They started schools for the blind. This is a huge change from first century thinking that they're unclean, that they're diseased, that they're not intelligent enough, or that they're being punished by God and don't deserve it. This is very, very different. Not only are they bringing them in, not just allowing them, who were born there to stay with their families, but bringing them in from outside of the city walls. It puts an end to the isolationist communities that used to happen in Western civilizations. And for the first time, it's support. This is the first time in history that they're trying to help. There was also a program started at this time in Palestine to take in the blind and deaf from off the streets. They didn't even make them live on the streets. They were giving them beds and rooms and shelters. In 700 CE, Saint John of Beverly miraculously taught, quote, the dumb boy of Hexen to speak. And this made Saint John the patron saint of teaching the deaf. Now, Saint Francis de Sales of 16th century France, he is the patron saint of the deaf. This guy in 700 C is the patron saint of teaching the deaf. So it's a different view. A lot of deaf culture does not look like kindly on this guy because his whole point to fame is forcing his spoken language onto the deaf and taking away their need for sign language, quote unquote. It's not really a good view, but at least they mentioned the deaf boy. So we get a mention in history. But this is all we know about the deaf boy. Everything else we know about the deaf boy of Hexen. It's one line. We know he was a boy. He was in Hexen, and John taught him to speak. Done. Um, Now, St. John, he was fascinated with language. So he wanted to see if language could be taught to someone who they didn't think could speak. 600 to 900 in the Tang Dynasty. They had the China Hand language. It is a possible leader for the first actual sign language to be used and acknowledged. It is still used today. So excited about this. By 20 million people in China. It is one of, if not the oldest known official deaf language. Now, the Bantu, my argument goes with them for first. They go all the way back to the ancient era. So, but this one isn't a multimodal language. This is a purely signed language. So there is a distinction here, and you don't have to agree with me. I will very happily accept the China Hand language could be the first sign language of the globe. I think that would be so cool. And I'm so excited to see that it is a still in use and active language today. Now let's come back to monastic sign language just for a moment. It was created in 1000 CE by Benedictine and Cistercian, also called Trappist, monks of Anglo-Saxon England. Now, some of the monasteries use it still today, but it's not a language. Again, this was meant to stop communication, not provide it. So if you look and you see, I have in the upper corner some examples of that's just the counting system. So they could count how much to set a table for, or how many barrels to bring in from the field. But you see on the pictures, there are 8 hand signs in the upper left-hand corner. And the figure shows that counting all happens on one hand. That is still true today in ASL. I can count all the way up to 1,000 before I need my second hand. But not all sign languages are the same. If you count, I believe in Britain, they use 2 hands for their number system. This was just one way, but it does show that it was a less is more kind of ideology for them. It was not about communication. It was quick, short, stop talking. The other image I have here to describe it for audio support people is showing some of their everyday activities. Right here, this was for going to sleep. This one was for food. And this last one was showing the sign for God, meaning it's time to go pray. '15th century Turkey. There are references to deaf people being recorded by officials in the Ottoman court. Lists of names of palace servants. Some were appointed like specific duties, and those were written down. Other people their names were recorded because they had technical skills that were used and called upon. 4 non-verbal were specifically of note here because they were guards or escorts for the Sultan when they traveled in Istanbul. Their signing system was really popular and was used by hearing people and was reported to be capable of expressing like really complex ideas. Um, this time period is really exciting because 15th century, we finally get to see like some recorded things in history, but it's very different than what we're expecting. Like if you're born deaf, that shows your profession, and that predates going all the way back to like 1200s, where your jobs are picked for you. If you're deaf, you can go work in a court because you can't hear the private conversations of the state officials. If you're nonverbal, you could be a guard because you could hear the danger, but you can't talk about what you heard state officials discussing. If you're down working in the harbors, they wanted you to be deaf or hard of hearing because the noises of the harbor wouldn't bother you and you couldn't hear captains discussing future plans or manifests of private cargo. But they still can't own property. They still can't use their own name in a marriage. Which means if you get married, you can't give your family name to your wife. They did have their own well-developed language and their own culture and their own entertainment. And that was cool. And the courts made notes of it around the 15th century. There are notes of courts using sign language for entertainment and games, and court officials would enjoy using it because they could conduct business over here and people could talk and enjoy the entertainment of court over here. And it was used. There are other people who recorded requesting it in their court because they just enjoyed watching it. It was better than dancing for them. Very cool time in Turkey. In 1527, we have Cabeza de Vaca. De Vaca came back from his trip to America with accounts of Aboriginals who fully spoke with their hands. He testified that sign language was a full language and it was in use when he got there. Now, this was verified in 1541 by Francisco Vasquez, who went and he saw the same thing. Now this is fascinating because it shows that the tribes and their multimodal language, that they had figured out that the Westerners didn't have anything like that. And so those that used it, they found trade languages, like amongst tribes, they would do this. They started doing that with these Western traders. And so his account of this signed language was used by Spanish when they went and traveled. They were looking for it because they knew with these sign languages that they could learn it and they could trade with these people. In 1500s, Plains Sign Language is really common. And I've talked about a lot of the indigenous tribes, but this is specific. In North America, there was a trade language that developed between the tribes of the indigenous that was called Plains Sign Language, PSL. And don't confuse that with my PSL, which is Pidgin Sign Language that I'm using right now, that I explained at the beginning. This is an official language. It is a full language, but it didn't start that way. It started as a technical language. And it was a common, they were common signs that all tribes could understand. They were cognitive words. So they could all trade between the tribes, and no one tribe had to give up their culture to learn another one. They could all share and be independent and use their accents. It's really cool. Tribes could be identified by their regional dialects, and it is still a part of their tribe's culture. The deaf within each tribe would use it every day to communicate, but it developed into their rites and their ceremonies so that they had their own individual identity and in this common one, so tribes could share celebrations together. It's really a cool integration. They could share their stories with each other. It's really nice. And I have a friend who told me that it developed some of their peace rights that they have today. So the turning point. This is the point where history is full of superstition about the deaf and so many other things. The Middle Ages is full of religious superstitions. Many of these stereotypes that we still see today started in this era. But progressives like St. Augustine and the Ottoman court, they started a trend that changed things. And yes, we see the start of the idea that we need to fix the deaf, make them speak, fix their hearing so they can hear. These ideas of the magic fix do start here, but it's also the start of a conversation. Any questions before I go into today? Fantastic. All right. The last half hour, we're going to talk about the Renaissance and today. We saw a huge leap in knowledge, science, like real science. We now know what germs are. We know that the deafness wasn't caused by an illness every time. It's not a religious punishment of God. All these things are discovered in this era. We see publicly funded schools for the deaf. We see recognition of sign language, and multimodal languages start to develop in philosophical and philanthropists ideologies. 1500s in East Africa. William Towerson's voyage to New Guinea. He counts how East African and Western Europeans used this silent trade language in order to facilitate trade relations without a common spoken language. Remember, I talked about this just before we reached this era, that we'd started to see these aboriginals and this silent mariners trade language that they created to communicate with Western traders. Well, here it's become popular like trade. By the time he gets there in the 1500s, this has been going on for like 200 years. They're like, yep, join in. Like, we know how to talk to you traveling people. So we're starting to see that getting back now to Europe proper, and they're like, oh, you behind? And so they start using it to do their trade business when they're trading in Upper Africa. In Italy at this time in the 1500s, there was a physician named Padua, and he said the deaf people can be taught to understand symbols by representing things with symbols. I know that like seems like common sense, but really he was the first person to acknowledge that the deaf could intellectually understand and communicate through symbology. It really like opened up people's understanding of what it means intellectually to be deaf. And that leads us here to Old Kent. This was an island in England that developed a high density of death, almost 50%. It lasted until the 1600s, almost 17. I have pictures of their alphabet up on this slide, and as you can see, it is a two-handed sign language. Now remember, our guy in our previous slide, Padua, see that he talked about the symbols? Looking at these signs, you can see that these two-handed signs are making symbols of the letters. This influenced a lot of how England looked at sign language and deaf language and symbols moving forward. Now, in Old Kent, the language kept developing, spoken and sign. Both parts are necessary. You can't understand Old Kent if you're only speaking the phenomes. It became a cultural expression, and it actually made the papers when people came and like were talking to them, it would get noted in the newspapers of the surrounding areas that this island talks differently. The first book that was written to teach sign language to deaf people was contained in a book written by Juan Pablo de Bonet in 1620. The images I have up here are a few of the pictures from that book, and that is a depiction of their alphabet. You'll notice it's missing a few letters. For those who can't see the images, it is 6 letters shy of a full alphabet. The reason for that is there are some sounds that are repeated, even though we spell them differently. So you didn't need a C and a K if you're making the K sound. You just needed one symbol to represent that sound. This book really depicts a very useful manual, daily kind of language. This isn't the philosophical language that Saint Augustine was talking about, but at the same time, it was faster. And we really start to see a development of deaf language where it's a development of language skills, not a replacement of language, if that makes sense. Now, here he also talks about the phonetic and clear articulation for teaching pronunciation. So this book is also used a lot with speech pathologists as they look at the development of phonomic language. When I was developing a technique to read lips better, I did refer to some of the phonomic principles that were started in this book. 1770s, Old French Sign Language is developed. VLSF, as it is shortened to, is not related to spoken Old French. It is a completely different language that was developed by a man named Monsieur Charles Michel de L'Epée. And he opened one of the first schools for the deaf in Paris. Records of the original VLSF language have been lost mostly, but we know from notes, records, and documents that reference this that he saw deaf signing as beautiful, but it was primitive. So he wanted to add new shapes and signs and symbols to reflect the French grammar. And so he made a new language to incorporate French grammar with these actual old signs of the first language of the deaf. He brought them together, and that is what VLSF is. And it's really kind of a cool first precursor. In Europe, it was named the first official language of the deaf. We now know that is wrong. But what it is a first for is a first new look at deaf language as a language. They're having a hard time now, starting in the early 1700s, to not admit that this is a language. When we start to enter the current era at the 1800s, we start to see deaf get a voice, and they get to start to say things, and we have new perspectives, and there's recognition of a culture. Now we're having discussions about culture. Deaf communities today are very, very, very concerned about their voice. I myself did not get the legal right to have a voice in the medical field until 1990. I was not allowed to voice for myself what educational needs, paths, majors, none. I could not make any of those choices for myself. My family had to do it for me for years. I was raising children with no legal rights. In 1988, the Gallaudet Speaks protest, the deaf community stood up and protested across the United States about the fact that they could not vote for their own student body president in their university, in a deaf university. So we had to march. The end of that march, we got our legal right to a voice. And it was Bush and Obama who wrote the ADA package that gave us our voice legally. So this is a very important part of deaf history for us. And so this era we get really excited about. In Naples, Italy, Andrea Di Giorgio was an Italian antiquator who's remembered for being the first ethnographer, which is the study of the systematic recording of human cultures. He is the first one to have recorded the ethnography of body language. In his work, La Mimica, oh, I'm not even going to say it. It means the mime of the ancients investigated through Neapolitan gestures. He captured live scenes of the deaf using Neapolitan sign language, which is a lost sign language, by the way. So this is one of the few recordings where we have evidence of their signs. It's really cool. Today in Italy, the deaf still do not have civil rights, and they are currently fighting with their legislature to have the first Italian sign language dictionary acknowledged and accepted by the government. So they don't get support, they don't have interpreters, that none of it. So this history in the 1800s with Andrea Di Giorgio, it's really important because it shows that in Italy at one time they did find this important, and that deaf were a part of their culture. And that over the years it has evolved to lose the deaf, and they now have to fight for their civil recognition again. But it is an important note in history that our study of what we know about body language and communicating through non-verbal means comes from this guy in Italy. In the 1800s, trade between Europe and Africa. Some rulers listed deaf people as cargo. Like, I sold this deaf person to this man, or I gave my friend this deaf person to use for this and as an act of charity. Cause see, I'm helping the deaf person, I gave them a job. The government allowed for the trade of people with disabilities, and it was seen as a humanitarian act, because otherwise they would just kick them out of the city. What were you going to do? Let them live on the streets? So the government of the Cape Colony would list it and counted deaf and dumb, quote unquote, people in 1875 without either motivation. It just become a custom at this point now at the end to just keep counting them. Well, we counted them when they were gifts. We counted them when it was an act of charity. We counted them when it was for humanitarian. This is the first sign of the deaf being included in what we would now call the census. And now that was the basis setup for the rest of Europe and how they counted deaf from that point moving forward. In 1816, Laurent Clerc, he helped develop American Sign Language. This is a famous deaf story in America, and nobody learns about deafness without hearing the famous story of Gallaudet's daughter. So the first actual teacher of the deaf in America was a French man who was a friend of Thomas Hopkins Gallaudet. And together the two of them founded the very first school, which became the university we now know today. Now, Laurent Clerc was born in France. He came to America to do missionary work. He saw his friend's daughter playing and she was deaf, and he could see there was intelligence there. He wanted to ask her about what game she was imagining, and he couldn't figure out how to talk to her. So he asked her dad, and his dad said, "I'll pay you to find a way for me to talk to my daughter. I've been trying for years. I love my daughter. I want to communicate." So he paid for Clerc to go to France. He learned French Sign Language. Remember, that was developed a few years back in the 1700s from his friend, another priest who's doing work in Paris. He brought back French Sign Language, but it didn't work. And the famous example was this. Chair, okay? Chair. You can see it. You can see how the symbol matches the sign. But for some things like toast, it didn't fit. The French sign is toast. But that's not how we made our toast in the 1800s of America. We used a fork and stuck it into the bread and roasted it over a fire. In France, they had a clamp that would held the bread and they would hold it over a fire. So he saw these differences and he saw that it was a cultural thing. The culture isn't like that, so the signs are going to work like that. So when he changed the picture to match American culture, all of a sudden it worked. That French grammar, beautiful. Keep it. It worked great. And now all of a sudden, we have a language that is based on French, not English, for all the deaf. They opened up schools, they've had universities now, and it all moved forward very, 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 very fast. Why? Because the deaf are smart. They just needed a way to communicate with hearing people. Now, here's something of note. Laurent Clark himself, he was born hearing, but when he was a baby, he fell into a fire, and he had actually lost his own hearing and his sense of smell. He read lips, and that was how he communicated until Thomas Gallaudet's daughter inspired him to find a sign language. In 1860s, in the US of A, we finally break into deaf culture on our own property. Deaf schools for Black children opened up in the 1860s. This segregation in early schools and in their dorm rooms and in the classrooms, it led to two separate sign languages being developed. One was American Sign Language. The other is Black American Sign Language. These are both official languages. They developed in their own rights. They have their own accents, grammar, and non-manual markers. And they both have a huge cultural significance and identity here in America. Gallaudet University did not even admit Black deaf students until 1950 itself. So it was huge when Gallaudet also acknowledged the acceptance of Black ASL. We also have LSM, which is Mexican Sign Language. The Latin community really has its own dialect and flavor and language. And it is really important motivation for me as who I'm half Mexican myself to go and learn Mexican Sign Language. Now, there are so many different languages, but to see an example of Black American Sign Language specifically, you want to go look at a coverage of George Floyd's funeral, or go look on YouTube for some fun ones. You can also find Mexican Sign Language on YouTube. You can find Omanian Sign Language on YouTube. It's beautiful what YouTube has given us. But it all started back here with the development of culturally relevant sign languages. In the early 1800s to the 1950s, we also had on the East Coast of the US of A, Martha's Vineyard Sign Language. This was an island off the East Coast. And it also had a high population of deaf, almost 50% deaf. So their language was both signed and spoken by the whole island, just like in Old Kent. Now, it is believed that Martha Vineyard Sign Language is the child of Old Kent Sign Language. And that is because immigrants from Old Kent have been tracked, leaving there was civil unrest at that time around Kent. So a lot of people migrated out, and in Old Kent, a large population of them migrated to Martha's Vineyard and became Americans. And you can see the similarities between Old Kent Sign Language and Martha Vineyard Sign Language. if you put the two like side by side. So there are a lot of academics who believe that the two languages are related and that Martha Vineyard Sign Language evolved from Old Kent. What was really cool is the island, it's the first time in the US you see true integration and equity. There was no barrier to participation. You saw deaf working paid jobs. You saw deaf living independently with independent families. They were able to go have the same life with the same expectations for life as their hearing counterparts. First time in history. 1966, Sweden takes the global front runner and declares for the first time in global history that deafness is not a disability. It is a linguistic minority. Legislatively, deaf are declared equals and have equal rights to language access, medical, education. Bruh. I have up here a picture of the Swedish alphabet. And if you look, you can see that same symbology. They still want to make the letters look like how they're written. And that is still a very cool leftover from the same area that started developing back in the Viking era and the ancient and Middle Ages through today. There are still some of their hand signs. In 2017, Indonesia. The official language is called Signed Indonesian, and it was designed by educators and historical researchers from Australia and Indonesia in a joint project. Their dictionary is based on a system that comes from the ministry work from across all the islands. They decided they were going to incorporate the signs from every tribal language to make a system that will be used in all the schools and on TV and in businesses across the country to unify them. It meant that deaf didn't have to go and attend special schools, and that's what started this whole thing. But the population of deaf in Indonesia is almost 50%. It's like a magic number that happens, and they realize that they can't continue this segregation. It doesn't work. So they integrated it, and it's been very, very successful. I'm really excited about it. California has one sign language interpreter for every 46 hearing impaired people. Saudi Arabia has one for about every 93,000 people. Now, across all the Arabic speaking nations, Arabic sign languages called ARSLs are still in their developmental stages. This is really exciting. We are watching the development of new languages. Only in the recent years has there been an awareness of the existence of these communities that we've been talking about for the last hour and a half. They just acknowledge that these communities exist. Every town, imagine every zip code in America having its own sign language, because that's what's happened in India and across much of the Arabic speaking countries. But some countries like Oman, they have developed their own sign language, and they are developing new deaf integration into their culture. These are so cool. I hope you guys follow along with some of the discussions or check back with me, because I find it exciting and fascinating to see as India comes together and started a Middle Eastern like movement. And Oman beat them to it. They've got theirs out and going and have for a few years, and India is still working on it. But they have there's a lot more smaller parts in India than there were in Oman, but it's been a very cool movement to watch. And as a conclusion, deaf communities have come such a long way, and it's really exciting to see the times ahead. There's a lot that we still don't know. There's a lot of misinformation still out there, but efforts are being made to retrain how people look at deafness and to save those old languages and to build a more equal future. And this whole point of this hour and a half was to show you that history is now. Look at The Voice or X Factor, and you'll see deaf singers. We have music. When you see in the news, when they say, those deaf cheerleaders performed their cheers entirely in silence, that's a lie. You need to be educated enough to know. Just because you don't know how to hear it doesn't mean it was silent. I watched those cheerleaders on that news report, and they cheered very loud. They projected. You could have heard that from the back if you knew how to hear it. So we need to educate our news and our media and our representation, and in the SCA, how we talk about, accept, and participate with deaf. We have deaf actors, and I am just very impressed by deafness today in the world, and I hope you are too. Thank you so much, everybody, for being here, and I appreciate your time. I am done. Any questions? Comments? Thank you. You're very welcome. Thank you for showing up and attending. I appreciate you. Thank you. Okay.
All right, I'm going to stop recording if we're done.
Yes, thank you.
Awesome. Thank you.